My name is James Callahan, but everyone who ever mattered to me called me Jack. I was born in 1923 in a small town in Pennsylvania where the winters were harsh and the people were tougher. I'm telling you this story because I'm one of the few left who can. Because the boys who were with me in that trench in France in the winter of 1944, they never got the chance to grow old. They never got to tell their children what happened to them. So I carry their stories with me, and today I'm going to share one of the hardest days of my life, the day I got stuck in that trench while they were taken out, one by one. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. If this story touches you, if it means something to you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These stories deserve to be heard, these men deserve to be remembered, and your support helps us keep their memories alive. Now let me take you back to December of 1944. We were somewhere in the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The official name for what was happening around us would later be called the Battle of the Bulge, but at that moment we didn't know we were part of history. We just knew we were cold, we were tired, and the Germans had broken through our lines in a way nobody had expected. I was a corporal then, 21 years old, attached to the 28th Infantry Division. We'd been through hell in the Hurtgen Forest just weeks before, and the brass had sent us to the Ardennes to rest and refit. Some rest that turned out to be. The morning of December 17th started with fog so thick you could barely see your hand in front of your face. We were dug in along a ridge overlooking a small valley, our foxholes and trenches connected by a network of shallow communication ditches that had been cut into the frozen earth. There were 12 of us in my section. 12 men I had fought beside, bled beside, and prayed beside for months. Sergeant Harold Peterson was our squad leader. We called him Pete. He was 34 years old, ancient by our standards, a career soldier who'd fought in North Africa before being shipped to Europe. Pete had a wife named Eleanor back in Minnesota and 3 daughters he'd never stopped talking about. He kept their photograph in his helmet liner, protected by a small piece of waxed paper he'd gotten from a supply sergeant. Then there was Private First Class Tommy Kowalski from Chicago. Tommy was 19, the youngest in our squad, with a nervous laugh and hands that shook when the shelling started. But Tommy was also the best shot among us. He could hit a target at 300 yards in conditions that would make a sniper jealous. He'd been a competition shooter back home, his father having taught him since he was 7 years old. Private William Jefferson, who we called Billy, came from Georgia. He was 22, soft-spoken and deeply religious. Billy carried a small Bible in his breast pocket that had belonged to his grandfather, a man who had fought in the Spanish-American War. Every night, no matter how tired we were, no matter how much danger surrounded us, Billy would read a passage out loud. Some of the men complained at first, but over time, even the non-believers found comfort in the rhythm of those words. There was Corporal Michael O'Brien from Boston, my closest friend in the unit. Mickey and I had met in basic training at Fort Benning, and we'd shipped out together, fought together, survived together. He was 23, same as me, with red hair and a temper to match. Mickey dreamed of opening a boxing gym after the war. He'd been a Golden Gloves champion in his youth and still shadow-boxed in the mornings when we weren't under fire. Private Salvatore Benedetto came from Brooklyn, New York. Sal was our medic, a former medical student who dropped out to enlist after Pearl Harbor. He was 25, calm under pressure, with steady hands that had saved more lives than any of us could count. Sal never talked about what he'd seen, but sometimes at night I'd hear him crying quietly in his foxhole. The next morning, he'd be right back at it, cracking jokes and checking our feet for frostbite. Private First Class. Robert Anderson was from Nebraska, a farm boy who'd never seen a city bigger than Omaha before the Army sent him to New York for processing. Bobby was 20, strong as an ox, with a gentle disposition that seemed completely at odds with the violence surrounding us. He wrote letters to his sweetheart Mary Ellen every chance he got, and she wrote back faithfully. He'd read her letters aloud sometimes, and we'd all pretend we weren't listening, even though we hung on every word. Private Leonard Franklin came from Detroit. Lenny worked on the assembly line at Ford before the war, and he could fix anything mechanical. He kept our weapons clean, our equipment running, and our spirits up with his endless supply of dirty jokes that he claimed came from his factory co-workers. Private George Phillips was from California, a surfer kid who seemed completely out of place in the frozen forests of Belgium. George was 21 and had never seen snow before basic training. He talked constantly about the beaches back home, about the waves and the sunshine and the girls in their bathing suits. We'd tease him about it, but secretly we all loved hearing about that world that seemed so impossibly far away. Private Raymond Chen was one of the only Chinese Americans in our regiment. Ray was born in San Francisco, his parents having immigrated from Canton before the First World War. He was 24, quiet and observant, with a sharp mind for strategy that Pete relied on heavily. Ray never complained about the discrimination he sometimes faced, but we all saw it, and we all hated it. In our squad, Ray was just one of us, no different from anyone else. Private Dennis Murphy came from Philadelphia, a former streetcar conductor who knew every trolley route in the city by heart. Dennis was 26, the second oldest after Pete, with a deep laugh and an encyclopedic knowledge of baseball statistics. He swore he was going to take all of us to see the Phillies play after the war. And finally, there was Private James O'Connor from rural Vermont. Jimmy was 20, a quiet kid who rarely spoke unless spoken to. He'd been a woodworker before the war, and he spent his downtime carving small figures from whatever scraps of wood he could find. He'd made each of us a small talisman. Mine was a bear, because he said I reminded him of one when I woke up grumpy in the mornings. These were the men I went into that trench with on December 17th, 1944. By the time the sun set, only 4 of us would still be alive. The attack came without warning. One moment the forest was silent, except for the occasional rustle of wind through the bare branches. The next, the world exploded in fire and thunder. German artillery shells began raining down on our positions with devastating accuracy. They had observed us during the night, mapped our positions, and now they were systematically destroying them. The first shell landed 20 yards to my left, throwing up a geyser of frozen earth and shattered timber. The concussion knocked me flat on my back, my ears ringing, my vision swimming. Pete was screaming orders, but I could barely hear him over the roar of explosions. I crawled to the edge of the trench, trying to find cover from the fragments of hot metal that were scything through the air. Another shell landed, closer this time, and I felt something sting my cheek. When I touched it, my fingers came away bloody. Through the smoke and chaos, I saw George Phillips stand up. Why he stood up, I'll never know. Maybe he was confused. Maybe he was trying to run. Maybe his body just reacted before his mind could process what was happening. It didn't matter. A fragment caught him in the throat and he went down without a sound, his California dreams dying with him in the frozen mud of Belgium. That was the first. The shelling lasted for 15 minutes, though it felt like hours. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was almost worse. We knew what was coming next. Through the dissipating smoke, I could see them, German infantry, emerging from the tree line on the opposite ridge like grey ghosts. There must have been at least a company, maybe more. They moved with professional precision, their white camouflage smocks blending with the patches of snow that dotted the forest floor. Pete grabbed my shoulder and pointed to the left flank. Our machine gun position had been destroyed in the barrage, the weapon twisted and useless, the 2 men who'd been manning it nowhere to be seen. Our only remaining firepower was our rifles, a few grenades and 1 Browning automatic rifle that Mickey was clutching like a lifeline. "We hold here," Pete shouted. "No retreat. We hold until reinforcements arrive or until there's nobody left to hold." We all knew there were no reinforcements coming. The Germans had broken through everywhere along the line. We'd heard the radio chatter before our communications went dead. Division headquarters was in chaos. Entire regiments were being overrun. We were on our own. I settled into my position, my rifle pressed against my shoulder, trying to control my breathing the way I'd been taught. The cold had numbed my fingers, but I could still feel the trigger, still align my sights on the approaching enemy. And Tommy Kowalski was set up beside me, his face pale but his hands steady. The kid who shook during artillery barrages was absolutely calm now that he could see his targets. He began firing with methodical precision, and with each shot, a German soldier fell. The return fire started immediately. Bullets cracked overhead, thudding into the frozen earth of the trench walls, splintering the wooden supports we'd erected. I fired back, working the bolt of my M1 Garand, the brass casings ejecting in an arc over my shoulder. I saw a German go down, then another. But for everyone we killed, 2 more seemed to take his place. That's when Billy Jefferson took a round through the chest. I heard him gasp, a sound that was almost polite, like he'd been surprised by something mildly inconvenient. I turned to see him looking down at the spreading stain on his uniform, his grandfather's Bible clutched in his hand. He looked up at me, and there was confusion in his eyes, as if he couldn't understand what had happened. Sal was there in an instant, sliding through the mud, his medical kit already open. But I could see from the wound that there was nothing he could do. The bullet had gone through a lung, maybe both. Billy was drowning in his own blood, and all the medical training in the world couldn't save him. "Tell Mama," Billy started to say, but he never finished. His eyes went glassy, and whatever message he'd wanted to deliver died with him in that trench. That was the second. We kept fighting. What else could we do? The Germans were closing in, their fire intensifying, their shouts echoing through the forest. I could hear their officers giving commands, organizing their assault. They knew we were weakened, knew they had the advantage. They could have simply waited us out, but they were pressing forward, eager to finish us and continue their advance. Private Dennis Murphy was the next to fall. He'd moved to a new position, trying to get a better angle on a German machine gun that had set up on our flank. He got off 3 shots before a burst of fire cut him down. I watched him fall, watched the life leave his body in a single moment, and I felt something inside me go numb. That was the third. The fighting blurred together after that. Time lost all meaning. There was only the next shot, the next target, the next moment of survival. My rifle grew hot in my hands, the barrel steaming in the cold air. The magazine emptied, and I grabbed another from my belt, slamming it home, resuming fire. Ray Chen had positioned himself at the far end of the trench, picking off Germans who tried to flank us. He was a natural tactician, always thinking 2 steps ahead, anticipating the enemy's movements. He'd already saved us twice by spotting infiltrators that the rest of us had missed. But even Ray couldn't see everything. A German grenade sailed into the trench, landing 3 feet from where Lenny Franklin was firing. I saw it happen as if in slow motion, saw the metal canister bouncing once on the frozen earth, saw Lenny's eyes widen in recognition. Without hesitation, Lenny threw himself on the grenade. The explosion was muffled by his body, but I still felt the concussion, still felt the spray of debris against my face. When I looked, there was nothing left of Lenny Franklin from Detroit, the man who could fix anything, the man who told the dirtiest jokes, the man who had just given his life to save the rest of us. That was the fourth. The sacrifice bought us time, but not victory. The Germans were too many and we were too few. Pete made the decision I'd been dreading. "Fall back to the secondary position," he ordered. "We can't hold here." The secondary position was a deeper trench about 30 yards behind us, connected by a narrow communication ditch. It was more defensible with better cover, but getting there meant exposing ourselves to enemy fire. Pete went first, sprinting across the open ground, his body hunched low. He made it, Mickey went next, the bar clutched in his arms, his red hair bright against the grey landscape. He made it too. I was about to follow when Bobby Anderson grabbed my arm. "Jack," he said, and his voice was calm, almost peaceful. "Tell Mary Ellen I loved her. Tell her I'm sorry I couldn't come home." Before I could respond, before I could even process what he was saying, Bobby stood up and began firing, drawing the German attention, giving the rest of us cover to retreat. I watched them cut him down, watched the bullets tear through his body, watched him fall back into the trench like a rag doll. But he'd done his job. He'd given us the seconds we needed. That was the 5th. I ran. God help me, I ran, leaving Bobby's body behind, leaving our positions, leaving everything we'd fought to hold. I dove into the communication ditch and scrambled toward the secondary position. The bullets snapping over my head, the shouts of German soldiers echoing in my ears. When I reached the deeper trench, I found Pete, Mickey, Tommy, Sal, Ray and Jimmy already there. 7 of us remained from the original 12. 7 out of 12, and the day was far from over. We took up new positions, fortified what we could, and prepared for the next assault. But something had changed in the enemy's approach. They weren't charging anymore. They were settling in, establishing positions, waiting. "They're calling up mortars," Ray observed, his voice flat. "They're done playing games." He was right. Within minutes, we heard the distinctive thump of mortar tubes being fired, followed by the whistle of incoming rounds. We pressed ourselves into the frozen earth, making ourselves as small as possible, praying to whatever gods we believed in that the next shell wouldn't land in our laps. Jimmy O'Connor, the quiet kid from Vermont who'd given me a carved bear, was killed by the first salvo. A mortar round landed directly in his position, and there was nothing left to bury. One moment he was there, alive, breathing, dreaming of going home to his woodworking shop. The next, he was simply gone. That was the 6th. The mortars continued for what felt like an eternity. We couldn't move, couldn't fight back, couldn't do anything but hunker down and hope. I found myself praying for the first time since I was a child, mouthing words to a God I wasn't sure I believed in, asking for deliverance, asking for survival, asking for just one more breath. Sal Benedetto caught a fragment in his side during the barrage. He didn't die immediately. He lay there in the mud, his hands pressed against the wound, trying to apply the same first aid he'd given to so many others. But he couldn't reach the injury properly, couldn't stop the bleeding, couldn't save himself the way he'd saved so many of us. I crawled to him, tried to help, but he pushed my hands away. "Save your strength," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You're going to need it." He was right. By the time the mortars stopped, Sal was gone, the medic who'd never talked about what he'd seen, the man who'd cried quietly in his foxhole at night, at peace at last. That was the 7th. 5 of us remained. Pete, Mickey, Tommy, Ray and me. 5 soldiers in a trench that had held 12, surrounded by an enemy that showed no signs of stopping. The Germans came again, emboldened by the mortar barrage, confident that we were finished, but we weren't finished. Not yet. We fought with the desperation of men who had nothing left to lose, who had watched their friends die around them, who refused to let those deaths be meaningless. Tommy Kowalski was firing with mechanical precision, his competition shooter's eye never failing, his hands steady despite the chaos. But even the best marksman can't protect himself from every direction. A German flanker got around our position, emerging from a crater we hadn't seen. He fired a single shot before Ray cut him down, but that single shot was enough. Tommy looked at me with surprise, the same expression Billy had worn when he'd been hit. There was a small hole in his forehead, almost delicate, like a third eye. He fell backward without a sound, the youngest member of our squad, the kid with the nervous laugh and the steady hands. That was the 8th. We were down to 4. 4 men in a trench that had held 12, fighting an enemy that numbered in the hundreds. The mathematics were simple, and they were not in our favor. Pete made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. "We need to split up," he said, his voice calm and measured. "If we stay together, they'll kill us all. Ray, you and Mickey go north. Try to link up with Baker Company if they're still holding. Jack, you stay with me. We'll hold here as long as we can, give you time to escape." Mickey started to argue, but Pete cut him off with a look. After months of fighting together, we all knew that tone, that expression. This was not a suggestion. This was an order. Ray nodded, his face unreadable. Mickey grabbed my arm, his eyes wet with tears he was too proud to shed. "I'll see you after this is over," he said. "We'll open that boxing gym together. I'll teach you to fight proper." I wanted to tell him so many things. I wanted to tell him he was the best friend I'd ever had, that I was grateful for every moment we'd spent together, that I was terrified of never seeing him again. But there was no time for any of that. The Germans were regrouping for another assault. "Go!" Pete said. "That's an order." Ray and Mickey slipped out of the trench and disappeared into the forest. I watched them go, watched my best friend vanish into the smoke and chaos, and I felt something break inside me that would never fully heal. Pete and I held our position. We fired at anything that moved, conserved our ammunition when we could, and made the Germans pay for every inch of ground they gained. Pete was a professional, a career soldier who'd been in impossible situations before. He knew how to fight, how to survive, how to make the enemy regret ever coming against him. But even professionals can die. The shot came from a sniper, hidden somewhere in the tree line. It took Pete in the neck, severing his carotid artery. He dropped his rifle and clasped his hands over the wound, but the blood was spurting between his fingers, painting the frozen earth red. I caught him as he fell, cradled his head in my lap, tried desperately to stop the bleeding, even though I knew it was hopeless. He looked up at me, and for a moment there was clarity in his eyes, a strange peace that seemed completely at odds with the violence around us. "Eleanor," he whispered, "tell Eleanor." He never finished the sentence. His eyes went glassy, his body went limp, and Sergeant Harold Peterson, who had fought in North Africa, who had 3 daughters he'd never stopped talking about, who had led our squad through hell and back, was gone. That was the 9th. I was alone. I don't know how long I lay there, holding Pete's body, staring at the sky through the bare branches of the trees. The sounds of battle seemed far away, muffled, like I was underwater. I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't process what had happened. The Germans found me like that. They came over the edge of the trench, their rifles pointed at my face, their eyes hard and cold. I expected them to shoot me. I wanted them to shoot me. Death seemed preferable to the crushing weight of survival, to the knowledge that I had lived while so many others had died. But they didn't shoot. They pulled me out of the trench, took my weapons, my equipment, everything I had. They bound my hands behind my back and marched me away from the position we'd fought so hard to hold. As they led me through the forest, I passed the bodies of my friends. George Phillips, still lying where he'd fallen. Billy Jefferson, his grandfather's Bible clutched in his dead hands. Dennis Murphy, Bobby Anderson, Jimmy O'Connor, all of them frozen in the poses of their final moments. I searched for Lenny Franklin, for Sal Benedetto, for Tommy Kowalski, but there was nothing left to find. The mortars and grenades had done their work too well. The Germans took me to a collection point where I found other American prisoners, men from different units who had shared our fate. We were loaded onto trucks and driven east, away from the fighting, away from everything we'd known. In the chaos of the German retreat weeks later, I would escape. I would make my way back to American lines, half frozen, half starved, barely human. I would be evacuated to a hospital in England where doctors would treat my wounds and psychiatrists would try to treat the damage they couldn't see. But that's a story for another time. What matters now is what happened to Mickey and Ray. I didn't learn their fate until after the war, when I finally tracked down their families and heard the truth. Mickey made it. He and Ray successfully linked up with Baker Company and helped repel a German assault on their position. They fought together for 3 more days until reinforcements finally arrived and the tide began to turn. On the 4th day, during a counterattack, a German tank shell landed near Ray's position. He was killed instantly, never knowing that the battle was already won. That was the 10th. Mickey carried Ray's body back to the American lines himself, refusing to leave his friend behind. He wrote a letter to Ray's parents in San Francisco, telling them what a hero their son had been, how he'd saved countless lives with his tactical brilliance, how he'd never once complained about the discrimination he faced. Mickey survived the war. He went home to Boston, opened that boxing gym he'd always dreamed about. He married a girl named Patricia, had 4 kids, lived a good life. I visited him once in 1962. We sat in his office, surrounded by boxing trophies and photographs, and we talked about that day in the Ardennes. We talked about the men we'd lost, the friends we'd buried, the pieces of ourselves we'd left behind in that frozen forest. Mickey cried that day. I did too. It was the first time either of us had allowed ourselves to grieve properly, to feel the weight of what we'd experienced. When I left, Mickey hugged me and told me he loved me like a brother. I told him I felt the same. Mickey died in 1987, a heart attack, quick and painless. His wife called to tell me, and I wept for hours. The last of my brothers from that day gone. Now there's only me, 101 years old, if you can believe it. I've outlived everyone I served with, everyone I fought beside, everyone who shared that terrible day in December of 1944. I am the last witness, the final keeper of their stories. I've spent my life trying to honor their memory. I went back to school after the war, got a degree in history, taught for 30 years at a high school in Pennsylvania. I made sure my students knew about the sacrifices of their grandfathers and great-grandfathers, about the price that was paid for the freedoms they enjoyed. I visited the graves of the men I lost, those who have graves to visit. George Phillips is buried in the American Cemetery at Henri Chapelle in Belgium. Billy Jefferson's family had his remains brought home to Georgia. Dennis Murphy rests in Philadelphia, Bobby Anderson in Nebraska, Sal Benedetto in Brooklyn. I've stood over each of their graves and told them I'm sorry. Sorry I lived when they didn't. Sorry I couldn't save them. Sorry it took me so long to visit. The ones without graves I remember differently. Lenny Franklin, who threw himself on a grenade to save his friends. Tommy Kowalski, the best shot I ever knew. Jimmy O'Connor, who carved me a bear that I still have on my nightstand. Pete, who led us with wisdom and courage until his last breath. Ray Chen, who never got the recognition he deserved because of the color of his skin. I carry all of them with me every day. They are the weight I bear, the burden I was chosen to shoulder, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Sometimes, late at night, I dream of that trench. I hear the shells falling, the bullets snapping, the screams of dying men. I see their faces, young and terrified, looking to me for answers I didn't have. I wake up sweating, shaking, reaching for a rifle that isn't there. My daughter tells me I should see someone about these dreams, that there are treatments now for what we suffered, but I don't want to forget. The dreams are my penance, my way of keeping faith with the dead. As long as I remember, they're not truly gone. I've been asked many times over the years why I survived when so many others didn't. Was it luck, skill, divine intervention? I don't know the answer, and I've stopped trying to find one. War doesn't make sense. It doesn't follow rules of fairness or justice. Good men die and lesser men live, and there's no explanation that can make peace with that reality. What I do know is this: I survived for a reason. Maybe that reason was to tell this story, to make sure the world knows what happened in that trench on December 17th, 1944. Maybe it was to live a good life, to honor the memories of those who couldn't. Maybe it was simply random chance, the universe's cruel indifference to human suffering. Whatever the reason, I've tried to make the most of it. I married a wonderful woman named Margaret in 1948. We had 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and 12 great-grandchildren. Margaret passed away in 2008, after 60 years of marriage, that I wouldn't trade for anything. She knew about my nightmares, about my guilt, about the weight I carried. She never asked me to put it down. She just stood beside me and helped me carry it. The world has changed so much since 1944. We've been to the moon, invented computers that fit in our pockets, connected every corner of the globe in ways we couldn't have imagined. But some things haven't changed. War still kills young men. Politicians still send soldiers to die for causes they don't fully understand. Mothers still weep for sons who never come home. I hope that by telling this story, I can change that even a little. I hope that by making you understand what happened in that trench, what was lost and what was sacrificed, you'll think twice before accepting war as inevitable. I hope you'll demand better of your leaders, your countries, your world. The men I fought with weren't heroes out of storybooks. They were ordinary people with ordinary dreams and ordinary fears. They wanted to go home, to see their families, to live their lives. They didn't want to die in a frozen forest thousands of miles from everything they loved. But when duty called, they answered. When their country needed them, they stepped forward. When their friends were in danger, they sacrificed everything, including their lives, to save them. That's what I want you to remember. Not the glory or the heroism, but the humanity. These were real people who really died, and their deaths diminished us all. I'm going to end this story now. I'm tired, and my memories grow heavy as I speak them aloud. But before I go, I want to say one more thing. To George, Billy, Dennis, Bobby, Lenny, Tommy, Jimmy, Pete, Ray, and Mickey, I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry I lived while you died. I've spent 80 years carrying your memories, and I'll carry them until the day I finally join you. I hope you're at peace. I hope there's a place beyond this world where the sun always shines and the war is finally over. I hope you've been watching as the world we fought for has grown and changed, and despite its flaws, kept moving forward. I'll see you soon, brothers. Save a spot for me. This has been James Jack Callahan, born 1923, veteran of the United States Army, 28th Infantry Division, survivor of the Battle of the Bulge, keeper of the memories of good men who deserved better. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for remembering. May their sacrifice never be forgotten. And now, I hear my Margaret calling me to dinner. Even at 101, she still worries I don't eat enough. But that's a recording, isn't it? She's been gone for 16 years now. 16 years, and I still hear her voice. Funny how the mind works. Anyway, that's my story. The day I got stuck in that trench while they were taken out, one by one. 8 good men killed in a matter of hours, 2 more who made it out with me, only to die later in different ways, in different places. And me, still here, still remembering, still trying to understand why. I don't have an answer. I'm not sure there is one. But I know this, their lives mattered, their deaths mattered, and as long as I'm alive to tell their stories, they matter still. Take care of yourselves, all of you who are listening. Hold your families close. Tell the people you love how much they mean to you. Life is short and precious and can be taken away in an instant. I know, I've seen it happen. God bless you all. God bless the men who fought beside me. And God bless the United States of America, the country we were willing to die for. This is Jack Callahan signing off. The winter of 1944 seems like a lifetime ago. In many ways, it is. I've lived more years since that day than I had lived before it. I've seen empires rise and fall, watched humanity walk on the moon, witnessed the birth of technologies that would have seemed like magic to the young man I was in that trench. But no matter how much time passes, no matter how much the world changes, I always return to that day. It is the defining moment of my life, the crucible that forged me into the man I became. Every decision I've made, every path I've chosen, has been shaped by what happened in those frozen hours. Let me tell you about the hours before the attack, about the quiet moments that preceded the chaos. Because war isn't all violence and death. There are long stretches of boredom, of waiting, of trying to stay warm and fed and sane in conditions that seem designed to destroy you. The night before the assault, we were huddled in our positions, trying to sleep despite the cold that seeped through every layer of clothing we wore. The temperature had dropped below zero, and our breath formed clouds that hung in the still air. We had built small fires in metal drums, trying to stay warm, but the heat they produced was pathetic against the relentless cold. I shared a foxhole with Mickey O'Brien that night. We were wrapped in every blanket and coat we could find, pressed together for warmth, like we used to do in the freezing barracks during basic training. The intimacy would have seemed strange in any other context, but in the Ardennes, in December of '44, survival trumped dignity. "Tell me about your family, Jack," Mickey said, his breath forming white clouds in the frozen air. I realize I've never asked. So I told him. I told him about my father, a steelworker who'd lost his job during the Depression and never quite recovered his pride. About my mother, a woman of fierce determination who'd held our family together through the hardest years. About my younger sister Eleanor, who had written me letters every week since I'd enlisted, letters filled with news from home that made the war seem far away. Mickey listened without interrupting, his eyes closed, a small smile on his face. When I finished, he told me about his own family, his father, a dock worker who died when Mickey was 12. His mother, who'd raised 4 boys by herself, working double shifts at a textile factory. His brothers, 2 of whom were serving in the Pacific while the youngest was still in high school. "When this is over," Mickey said, "I want you to come to Boston, meet my family. My ma would love you." "I'd like that," I said, and I meant it. We talked through most of that night, sharing stories and dreams and fears. Mickey told me about Patricia, a girl he'd met at a dance hall before shipping out. He had her photograph in his pocket, a pretty brunette with a shy smile. He was going to marry her when he got home, he said, going to have a dozen kids and coach them all to be boxers. I told him about my own dreams, modest as they were. I wanted to go to college on the GI Bill, maybe become a teacher. I wanted to help young people understand the world, to give them the tools they needed to navigate it. I wanted to make something meaningful out of my life, to justify the survival that fate seemed determined to grant me. As dawn approached, our conversation drifted to deeper waters. Mickey asked me if I believed in God, and I told him I wasn't sure. I'd been raised Catholic, went to Mass every Sunday until I enlisted, but the things I'd seen in Europe had shaken my faith. How could a loving God allow such suffering? How could he watch his children slaughter each other and do nothing to stop it? Mickey nodded thoughtfully. He'd had the same doubts, he said, but he'd come to a conclusion that brought him peace. "I don't think God controls what happens in this world," he said. "I think he gave us free will and stepped back, letting us make our own choices. The evil we see, the suffering we endure, that's on us. We're the ones who chose to fight this war. We're the ones who built the bombs and the tanks and the guns. God didn't do that, we did." "Then what's the point of praying?" I asked. Mickey smiled. "Comfort, I guess. Connection. When I pray, I feel like I'm not alone, like there's something bigger than me out there, watching, caring. Maybe that's enough." I've thought about that conversation many times over the years. I'm still not sure I believe in God, but I believe in what Mickey said about connection. We are not meant to face life's trials alone. We need each other, need community, need love. That's the real lesson of that day in the Ardennes. Not that war is hell, though it is, but that humanity at its core is capable of extraordinary love and sacrifice. The men who died beside me didn't give their lives for flags or ideologies. They gave them for each other. Lenny Franklin didn't throw himself on that grenade for America. He did it for the friends who would have died if he hadn't. Bobby Anderson didn't stand up and draw enemy fire for democracy. He did it so that his brothers could escape. That kind of love is rare and precious. It's forged in the crucible of shared suffering, tempered by the knowledge that tomorrow might never come. I've experienced it only once in my life, in that frozen forest with those 11 men. And even though most of them are gone now, the love remains. It's part of me, as integral to my being as my bones and blood. Let me tell you about the moment the attack began, because I glossed over it earlier, and it deserves more attention. The first sign was the silence. The forest had been full of small sounds, birds calling, branches creaking, wind rustling through the undergrowth. Then suddenly, nothing. An absence so complete it was almost a presence. Pete noticed it first. He held up his hand, signaling for quiet, and we all froze, straining our ears for any hint of what had caused the wildlife to flee. The answer came seconds later, in the form of a distant whistle that grew louder with terrifying speed. The first shell exploded 50 yards ahead of our position, throwing up a fountain of dirt and debris. Then the barrage began in earnest. I've tried to describe artillery bombardments to people who haven't experienced them, and I've never been able to capture the reality. It's not just the sound, though the sound is deafening. It's not just the concussion, though the concussion can knock you flat from 20 yards away. It's the feeling of complete helplessness, of knowing that your survival depends on nothing more than chance. You can't run from artillery. You can't fight back against it. You can only dig as deep as you can, make yourself as small as possible, and pray that the next shell doesn't land on top of you. The randomness of it is the worst part. The shell that kills you doesn't know your name, doesn't care about your dreams or your fears or the people who love you. It's just a piece of metal following the laws of physics, and where it lands is a matter of trajectory and timing and pure dumb luck. George Phillips died in the first minute of the bombardment. He shouldn't have stood up. Every instinct, every piece of training told him to stay down. But instincts fail under extreme stress. Training gets overridden by panic. George stood up, and a fragment of hot metal ended his life in a fraction of a second. I've often wondered what he was thinking in that moment. Was he confused, disoriented by the explosions? Was he trying to run? Or did some deeper instinct take over, some primal need to flee that evolution had programmed into our ancestors millions of years ago? I'll never know. George took the answer with him when he died. The bombardment lasted 15 minutes. 15 minutes of lying in a shallow trench while the world exploded around me. 15 minutes of pressing my face into the frozen mud, praying to a God I wasn't sure existed, trying to control the terror that threatened to overwhelm me. When it finally stopped, my ears were ringing so loudly I couldn't hear anything else. I looked around, trying to assess the damage, trying to find my friends. Pete was there, his face pale but determined. Mickey was checking his bar, making sure it hadn't been damaged. Billy was clutching his Bible, his lips moving in silent prayer. We'd survived, at least for now. Then the infantry came and the real fighting began. I've told you about the men who died in the assault, but I haven't told you about the Germans we killed. I don't like to think about them, don't like to remember their faces as they fell. They were human beings too, with families and dreams and fears. They were soldiers doing their duty, same as us. The fact that they wore a different uniform, spoke a different language, served a different flag, doesn't make their deaths any less tragic. But in the heat of battle, you don't think about that. You can't afford to. Every German soldier is a threat to your survival and the survival of your friends. Your job is to eliminate that threat as efficiently as possible. Moral considerations get set aside, locked away in a part of your mind that you'll revisit later, when the fighting is over and the nightmares begin. I know I killed at least 6 men that day, probably more, in the chaos of the assault. I remember each one with terrible clarity. The young soldier who couldn't have been older than Tommy Kowalski, who looked at me with wide eyes as my bullet found his chest. The officer who was shouting orders when I dropped him mid-word. The machine gunner who was cutting down American soldiers until I flanked his position and ended him. These deaths were necessary. They saved the lives of my friends, at least for a few more hours, but that doesn't make them weigh any less on my conscience. Those German soldiers had mothers who loved them, sweethearts who waited for them, futures that will never unfold. I took all of that away from them, and no amount of justification can change that fact. After the war, I struggled with this reality. I went through a period of severe depression, unable to reconcile the violence I'd committed with the person I wanted to be. I drank too much, pushed people away, considered ending my own life more than once. What saved me was teaching. When I finally went back to school and earned my degree, when I stood in front of a classroom for the first time, something shifted inside me. I couldn't undo the deaths I'd caused, but I could try to prevent future ones. I could educate young people about the horrors of war, help them understand its true costs, encourage them to seek peaceful solutions to conflict. That became my penance, my way of balancing the scales. For every life I took in 1944, I tried to positively influence 100 more. I don't know if it worked, if the cosmic ledger is any more balanced than it was. But it gave me purpose. It gave me a reason to keep living. Let me tell you about what happened after Pete died, because those last hours alone in the trench were some of the most difficult of my life. I held his body for a long time, too long probably. The Germans were closing in, and I should have been fighting, trying to escape, doing something other than cradling the corpse of my dead sergeant. But I couldn't move. The weight of everything that had happened, all the death and destruction, had finally crushed my will to continue. I remember thinking that death would be a relief. No more fighting, no more fear, no more watching friends die around me. I could just let go, let the Germans finish me, and be at peace. But then I thought about Mickey. He was out there somewhere, counting on me to draw the enemy's attention, to buy him time to escape. If I gave up, his sacrifice, all their sacrifices, would be meaningless. The Germans would continue their advance, overwhelm Baker Company, kill Mickey and Ray just like they'd killed everyone else. That thought got me moving. I laid Pete's body down gently, closed his eyes, and took his rifle. Mine was almost out of ammunition, but Pete's was freshly loaded. I also took his grenades, his water canteen, and the photograph of Eleanor and their daughters. I would make sure she got it, I promised him silently. I would tell her he loved her until the very end. Then I started shooting. I don't know how many Germans I killed in those final hours. I don't know how long I held that position alone. Time had lost all meaning. There was only the next target, the next reload, the next moment of survival. At some point I ran out of ammunition. My rifle was empty, Pete's was empty, I had no more grenades. I found Billy's pistol on his body and used that until it was empty too. Then I grabbed a shovel and prepared to fight hand to hand. That's when the Germans captured me. They came over the edge of the trench, and I swung the shovel at the first one, catching him in the shoulder. But the second one hit me with the butt of his rifle, and I went down hard, seeing stars. When I came to, I was being dragged through the forest, my hands bound, my head throbbing. The battle was still raging somewhere behind us, but the sounds were growing fainter. The Germans had won. Our position had fallen. Everything we'd fought for, everything my friends had died for, was lost. The next few weeks were a blur of prisoner camps and forced marches. The Germans were retreating by then, their offensive broken by American counterattacks. They dragged us eastward, into the heart of the Reich, further from our lines with every passing day. I escaped in early February, during a chaotic night when American bombers hit the column we were marching with. In the confusion, I slipped into the forest and disappeared. I walked for 6 days, surviving on scraps I found in abandoned farmhouses before I finally reached American lines. The soldiers who found me didn't recognize me as one of their own at first. I was filthy, emaciated, barely human. My uniform was in tatters, my face hidden behind a wild beard. I had to recite my serial number 3 times before they believed I was American. They evacuated me to a hospital in England, where I spent 2 months recovering. The physical wounds healed quickly enough. The mental ones took much longer. I still wake up some nights expecting to be back in that trench, surrounded by the bodies of my friends. But I survived. That's what matters. I survived, and I've lived a long and meaningful life. I've known love and loss, joy and sorrow, triumph and failure. I've watched my children grow up, met my grandchildren and great-grandchildren, seen the world change in ways I never could have imagined. And through it all, I've carried the memories of those 12 men who went into that trench with me. They're part of me now, woven into the fabric of my being. When I finally die, which won't be long now, I'll take them with me into whatever comes next. I hope there's something on the other side. I hope I'll see them again, young and whole and free from pain. I hope we'll sit around a fire somewhere, sharing stories and laughing at old jokes, finally at peace after all these years. But if there's nothing, if death is simply an end, that's okay too. I've made my peace with it. I've lived a full life, loved and been loved, made my contribution to the world. What more can anyone ask for? So that's my story. The story of a day in December 1944, when 12 men went into a trench and only one walked out alive. It's a story of courage and sacrifice, of friendship and loss, of the terrible things human beings are capable of, and the beautiful things as well. I've told it as truthfully as I can, though memory is a tricky thing and 80 years is a long time. Some details have faded, smoothed over by the passage of time. Others remain as sharp as the day they happened, burned into my mind forever. What I hope you take from this story is not glory or heroism, but understanding. Understanding of what war really costs, not just in lives, but in souls. Understanding of the bonds that form between soldiers, bonds that transcend friendship and become something deeper, something sacred. Understanding of the responsibility we all bear to prevent such tragedies, to build a world where young men don't have to die in frozen trenches far from home. The generation that fought World War II is almost gone now. There are only a handful of us left, old men and women with fading memories and failing bodies. Soon we'll all be gone, and the war will pass from living memory into history. Before that happens, I want to make sure these stories are told. I want future generations to know what happened, to understand the sacrifices that were made. I want them to honor the dead not with monuments and parades, but with peace. With a commitment to resolving conflicts without violence, to finding common ground instead of battlegrounds. That's the legacy I hope to leave, not as a hero because I'm not one, just as a witness, a man who was there, who saw what happened, who refused to let it be forgotten. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. Thank you for keeping the memory of those good men alive. This is Jack Callahan signing off one last time. May God bless you all, and may He grant peace to the souls of George Phillips, Billy Jefferson, Dennis Murphy, Bobby Anderson, Lenny Franklin, Tommy Kowalski, Jimmy O'Connor, Harold Peterson, Ray Chen, and Mickey O'Brien. They were my brothers. They were heroes. They were the best men I ever knew. And I will never forget them. Not as long as I live. Which, at 101, might not be much longer. But that's okay. I'm ready. I've been ready for 80 years. Ever since that day in the trench when I should have died with them. But didn't. For reasons I'll never understand. Rest easy, brothers. I'll be home soon.